Hey everybody, this is the second section of State Capitalism and World Revolution by CLR James, Raya Dunayevskaya, and Grace Lee Boggs. This section is titled The Stalinist and the Theory of State Capitalism. It is very easy to quote from In Defense of Marxism how the Mensheviks stuck to the concrete while Lenin began with dialectical materialism. To carry out Leninism in practice, however, is another matter. Strictly speaking, we should begin with philosophy, but we postpone that to the end of this document where it sums up the whole. We shall begin instead with political economy. It is not because of the policy of the Fourth International that the world revolution has suffered such defeats. Stalinism is the enemy. We have to pose the question in opposition to Stalinism. For many years now, the whole gigantic theoretical machinery of Stalinism has had one main theoretical enemy. This enemy, it will surprise most members of the Fourth International to learn, is the theory of state capitalism, whether applied to Russia or countries abroad. We have to add that the Fourth International either does not know or does not care about what the Stalinists are doing in this field. As we shall see, that is not at all accidental, but it makes our task particularly difficult. Before we discuss, we have to state the facts and conditions of discussion. Marx removed political economy from intellectual theorizing and made political economy a weapon of the class struggle. Marx placed it in the very heart of the capitalist system and the process of production itself. For Marx, the fundamental antagonism of society was the contradiction between the development of the productive forces and the social relations of production. Inasmuch as this conception is what the Stalinists are using all the power of the Russian state to destroy, we must spend some time here. In the United States since 1935, the working class in the CIO is mobilized to fight any increase in the productivity of labor. Speed up does not mean necessarily work beyond physical or mental endurance. The proletariat as a class is opposed to increase of productivity of labor in any form, whether it is speed up of the line or the machine or the further division of labor. The proletariat is convinced in the very marrow of its being that any such increase is obtained only at the expense of its own most vital material and spiritual interests. But the capitalist class is equally convinced that the desire of the workers to have the decisive word on production standards is opposed to the vital interest of the capitalist system which they represent. Both sides are absolutely correct upon the basis of capitalist production. The clash is final and absolute. Marx established that as long as the proletariat did not rule production, production knew and could know no other method of progress, but the increase of constant capital, machinery, and mechanization at expense of variable living labor. The only revolution which could save society was the proletarian revolution in the process of production. Further, Marx showed that this system not only created the violent clash in social relations, inevitably the rate of profit would fall, and theoretically at a certain stage the economy would not be able to expand any further because it would lack sufficient surplus value. In a strictly logical theory, Marx expressly excluded any idea that the system would collapse because goods could not be sold. In his analysis of capitalism, Marx made it absolutely clear that the capitalist could sell all the goods he produced. This would not alter the conditions of the workers in the factory. It is possible to keep silent about this, but to deny it, that is impossible. The Stalinists do not go so far. All Marx's theories of crisis, overproduction, commercial crisis, etc., to which he paid careful attention, are all based on this foundation of relations in production. All his opponents, however, differentiated among themselves, are united in this, that they see the solution of the crisis of capitalism in every conceivable place except the reorganization of the productive process by labor itself. From Section 1, Chapter 1, Volume 1 of Capital, this is precisely what Marx opposed. The very categories Marx used and the content Marx gave to them as categories of exploitation were derived from his analysis of the mode of labor, and without it he could not have succeeded in defeating all his opponents. It is obvious, therefore, that the Marxian theory from its very elements is an invincible weapon against the capitalist class as a usurping bureaucracy. Whether the property is private property or state property, it is equally obvious that a bureaucracy caught in the throes of economic crisis and in the name of Marxism exploiting millions of workers has a deadly enemy in this theory. If the Marxian categories apply to Russia, then it is a simple matter to say that Russia is a form of state capitalism. The Marxist categories therefore become the Stalinist bureaucracy, the concrete theoretical enemy. New section. The Stalinists revise Marxist capital. In 1943, Leontiev published his celebrated Political Economy in the Soviet Union. There was a crisis in political economy in the Soviet Union. Leontiev tells us that for years, the teaching of political economy had stopped entirely. The reason will astonish most of the readers of this document. The Soviet youth studying capital found themselves unable to see how the categories money, wages, etc., as described in Capital, differed from the categories as they appeared in the Russian reality. No such doubts trouble orthodox Trotskyists. Leontiev described the measures adopted. Economists were henceforth to teach A, that these categories existed before capitalism, hence are not integral to capitalism. B, that they meant something different in each period and hence mean something different in Russia. Thus Marx's analysis of the categories of capitalism, the foundation of Marxism, received the first blow. But the Stalinist theoreticians had something positive to substitute. Above all, the Stalinist theoreticians said, these categories have always been part and parcel of private property capitalism and exploitation of man by man. There is no private property in Russia, hence no exploitation of man by man. Hence these categories are not the same. But this ridiculous sophistry could not shake capital. 2 years later, the Stalinists had to drop the pretense that the only, quote, teaching, end quote, of political economy was being changed. 2 years later, the Stalinists had to drop the pretense that only the, quote, teaching, end quote, of political economy was being changed. Nothing short of a break with the dialectic structure of capital would do. They had to reorganize Capital, the book, thoroughly, beginning with page 1 of chapter 1 of volume 1. Marx had begun the analysis of capitalism with the analysis of the commodity. The Stalinists repudiated Marx's method, stating that to, quote, preserve unchanged the same sequence, end quote, would be, quote, ludicrous and harmful pedantry, end quote. The new theory was explained for English readers in Marx's Capital, an aid to the study of political economy, by Leontiev in 1946. The Stalinists have drowned Marx's specific categories of capitalist exploitation. The Stalinists have to, because the Stalinists cannot differentiate Marx's specific categories of capitalist exploitation from the economic system in Russia. The Stalinists know who the enemy is. In his article, Leontiev thundered against the, quote, Trotskyite Bukharinist wreckers, end quote. Quote, it is known that enemies of socialism of various brands, bourgeois economist wreckers, restorers of capitalism from the camp of the Trotskyite Bukharinist Agency of Capital. Jesus Christ. The Trotskyite Bukharinist Agency of Fascism have tried to extend to socialist economy the laws of capitalist economy. To suit their record counter-revolutionary purposes, they have slanderously perverted the character of the socialist relations that have been introduced among us, falsifying them, repainting them in the colors of capitalist relations, end quote. We hope no one believes that the Stalinists go through all this merely for, quote, Trotskyite Bukharinist fascist, end quote. To anyone who knows them and reads Leontiev's article, it is perfectly obvious that there is inside Russia itself a tendency to call Russia state capitalism, and the Stalinists can only fight it by mutilating Capital, the book. The Stalinists must attempt in theory as well as in practice to destroy every manifestation of the developing revolution in Russia. The theory of state capitalism is the theoretical foundation for this revolution. New section. The Stalinists and the falling rate of profit. Orthodox Trotskyism lives peaceably while all this goes on. It repeats, state property, therefore no laws of capitalism. The whole meaning of the present discussion is that those days are over. But what about overproduction? Asks Orthodox Trotskyism. There can be no overproduction in Russia, hence the system is superior, etc., etc. The Stalinists are taking care of that too. The method is to destroy the theory of the falling rate of profit and substitute the theory of the market under consumptionism. If state property, and not the total reorganization of labor, is the solution to the contradiction of capitalism, then the proletariat has only to work hard, and very hard, until in the fullness of time there is enough for all. In 1943, Leontiev wrote in his essay a moderate paragraph which looked innocent but was part of the assault on capital and the Russian proletariat. Quote, ... The law of value under capitalism operates through the law of the average rate of profit, whereas in the socialist system of national economy, the law of the average rate of profit has lost its significance, end quote. Thus, in place of the law in the decline in the rate of profit, i.e. the insoluble contradiction of capitalism due to value production, the Stalinists have substituted the average rate of profit, or the distribution of the total profits among the capitalists. The average rate of profit is singled out as the crucial feature of Volume 3 of Capital. Footnote. Insignificant minority as were Johnson Forrest, we did what we could to defend Marxist theory against Stalinist revision. Through the agency of Raya Dunayevskaya, we forced publication of the document by translating it, attacked Leontiev, and routed the chief Stalinist fellow travelers in the United States who came to his defense. I think one of those fellow travelers was Paul Sweezy. I'm not sure though. End footnote. Prior to World War I, the debates in the Marxist movement revolved around Volume 2 of Capital. The theory of accumulation was urgent only insofar as the theory of accumulation concerned whether imperialist expansion could solve the contradictions of capitalism. By World War II, this was no longer the question. Not only had the contradictions of capitalism not been solved by imperialist expansion, there was a crisis in productivity on a world scale. The debate of necessity has shifted from Volume 2, expanded reproduction, to Volume 3, decline in the rate of profit. The debate over Volume 3 of Capital is the debate over the developing revolution on a world scale and especially Russia. If the problem is selling goods, then there is obviously no economic reason for the collapse of bureaucracy. If, however, the problem is the rate of surplus value in production needed for expansion, then the bureaucracy is faced with a revolution in the process of production itself. It's very bizarre. Profit and value, surplus value, are fundamentally dependent for their realization, to have proof of their existence, on their successful exchange, which is I suppose one of the critiques that could be made of state capitalist theorizing, is that it is very unspecific with the concept of, I haven't read this thing, so I don't know what is going to be said or what is said, or I'm not an expert on it. But it seems like one of the main critiques that could be made of a state capitalist or a poorly constructed state capitalist thesis, at the very least, is that it does not give full room for the specificity of surplus product as surplus value, right? So you can have theoretically have an extremely, it's not beyond the possibility of having an extremely exploitative system that does not, where the surplus does not take the form of value, right? Like surplus product and surplus value are two distinct categories, right? I would say that surplus product would be an infinitely more general category applicable to a lot of societies theoretically and historically beyond capitalism, whereas surplus taking the form of value is something rather specific to capitalism. Uh, and if you can demonstrate, and I'm not in a position to do this because I'm not very, all this is fairly newish to me. I'm not in a position to say whether surplus product in the Soviet Union didn't take the form of value, but that would be kind of like I think that would be kind of like the crux around whether the USSR was capitalist or not. Yeah, I mean, you can say things like, okay, people were still remunerated in wages, those who weren't slave laborers, and you can say there was some form of money, which what the role of the ruble was in Stalinist Russia is complicated. It seems like. So, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Basically, there's the thing: is that you can have an extremely brutal exploitative system that tries to shrink, tries to expand labor time and shrink the consumption of the direct producers maximally, and that not be a capitalist system. But so let me reread that last little short paragraph I read while I was talking to myself. The debate over Volume 3 of Capital is the debate over the developing revolution on a world scale, and especially in Russia. If the problem is selling goods, then there is absolutely no economic reason for the collapse of the bureaucracy. If, however, the problem is the rate of surplus value in production needed for expansion, then the bureaucracy is faced with a revolution in the process of production itself. It will be possible to fill 20 volumes of books with quotations about overproduction from Marx and Marxists. In this dispute, they will have the same validity as the numerous witnesses the chicken stealer was prepared to bring who hadn't seen him steal the chickens. They will not alter the fact that Marx's theory of capitalist collapse is based, though not exclusively, upon the falling rate of profit. It assumes all the goods are sold, there is no overproduction, and yet capitalism will collapse. The importance of this for the analysis of Stalinist Russia is obvious. It destroys the Stalinist contention that because Russia, unlike capitalism, has no problem of sale of goods, the Russian economy is superior. We have in many places taken up this question in full. Here we only state the case. As late as 1935, Maurice Daub, British Stalinist, says, quote, "Consumption was an accident, an important incident in the total selling, ... and at the same time it remained only a facet. And it seems clear that Marx considered the contradiction within the sphere of production, the contradiction between growing productive power, consequent on accumulation, and falling profitability of capital, between the productive forces and productive relations of capitalist society, as the essence of the matter," end quote. Political Economy and Capitalism, Maurice Daub. No kind of underconsumption could pass as Marxism, chiefly because Lenin, who wrote constantly of anarchy of production, individual appropriation, etc., had nevertheless written the finest analysis of capital in existence, a devastating and comprehensive polemic against all who tried to say that capitalism would collapse because capitalism could not, quote, realize, end quote, profit, i.e. sell its goods. Footnote, see especially the first chapter of his Capitalism in Russia, quote, Theoretical Mistakes of the Narodnik Economists, end quote, translated into English by Freddie Forrest in New International, October, November, December 1943. footnote. Eugene Varga in Russia, however, with some sneaking apologetics, for Varga knows better, for years propagated the view that capitalism would collapse from underconsumption while the nationalized production could not. Then in 1942 appeared the theory of capitalist development by Paul Sweezy. Sweezy posed two fundamental types of crisis. Quote, in the one case we have to do with movements in the rate of profit. Quote, in the one case we have to do with movements in the rate of profit. Quote, in the one case we have to do with movements in the rate of surplus value and the composition of capital with the value system remaining intact, end quote. This is the Marxist view, the political economy of the proletariat. Paul Sweezy has another view. Paul Sweezy goes on to say, quote, in the other case we have to do with as yet unspecified forces tending to create a general shortage in effective demand for commodities, end quote. This is the political economy of underconsumption. Previously it could be used to some degree by the petty bourgeoisie. Today it is the absolutely inescapable political economy of the bureaucracy. Marx's analysis showed that inevitably, though the massive profit would grow, total profit in relation to total capital would grow less and less, and theoretically would bring the system to a standstill. It is only after having proved this that Marx takes up overproduction, etc. Footnote. The falling rate of profit is no longer theory. Like so much of Marx's abstract analysis, the proof now is before our eyes. Who in his senses today thinks that the world is suffering from an excess of capital? Where? In Britain and France and Italy and in Japan and India and Brazil and China? Where? Pray where? From everywhere the cry rises for capital. The total mass of surplus value produced in relation to the total social capital is hopelessly inadequate. It may be useful, though we doubt this, to point out the fabulous profits of this or that company in the United States. This is no more than a variety of American exceptionalism. These profits will never be able to rebuild world economy. Europe, China, India under capitalism will perish for lack of capital to continue ever greater expansion. This capitalist system is finished for good and all. Only the released proletariat can produce sufficient to rebuild society. No one has to read Marxism any longer to understand this. All that is necessary is to look. End footnote. Sweezy says that Marx's analysis of the falling rate of profit seems to be some rough notes he just jotted down. Footnote. Comrades should not spend all their indignation on this. They will need some a few pages later and not for Sweezy. End footnote. Sweezy scoured the 3 volumes of Capital in an attempt to prove his underconsumptionist interpretation. Sweezy could find nothing but some odd scraps which were already notorious as completely inadequate. He had to admit as much. But Sweezy would not give up. Instead, Sweezy proposes, quote, another view is possible, however, namely, that in these scattered passages Marx was giving advance notice of a line of reasoning which, if he had lived to complete his theoretical work, would have been of primary importance in the overall picture of the capitalist economy, end quote. Sweezy. So that in 30 years and nearly 3,000 pages, Marx was merely giving advance notice. Sweezy's book was written in 1942. Since then, in the latest issue of Science and Society, spring 1950, his fellow traveler has become the authentic voice of the Stalinist maneuver to defend Russia against the theory of state capitalism. As usual, the maneuver takes the form of historical analysis. As always, it seeks desperately to remove the class struggle from the process of production. In this article, Sweezy has reached the advanced stage of replacing the Marxist concept of the internal contradiction in production with a wholly external contradiction between production for use and production for the market. It's confusing me. In this article, Sweezy has reached the advanced stage of replacing the Marxist concept of the internal contradiction in production with a wholly external contradiction between production for use and production for the market. We hope, therefore, that this ghost of overproduction, which has stalked about in our movement so long and disrupted economic analysis of Russia, will go to its grave and stay there, or if it reappears, will be injected by its sponsors, however temporarily, with some real blood and life.